After months of searing heat and sparse rainfall, US farmland is drying up. What will the impact be on global food prices? You're watching Inside Story Americas from Washington. Hello, I'm Hebebrand. For weeks, the United States has been suffering its most extensive drought in half a century, and meteorologists expect the severe conditions to continue. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration released this animation showing how the drought has expanded since the beginning of the year, and as you can see, it's the US heartland that's primarily affected. It's known as the breadbasket of the country and of the world. The US dominates the global corn market. But the US Department of Agriculture has predicted a sharp drop in corn exports, and prices for corn and for soybeans have already hit record highs. Corn is what's called a mega crop, used in the production of everything from meat to cereal to sugary drinks and fuel. As a result, rising prices have the potential to lead to another global food crisis. The 2008 food crisis was triggered by a sharp rise in the cost of wheat and rice. That led to protests in parts of Africa, the Middle East, and Latin America. It will be months before the full impact of the US drought is fully known. But Al Jazeera's John Hendren spoke to one US farmer in the state of Indiana who says the damage done to the crops have made them beyond repair.
Okay, well this is some of the worst drought-stricken corn that we have. This corn should be 8 to 10 feet high and not 4 feet high. As you can see, there was no tassel. This is a tassel that sheds pollen that comes down and pollinates the ear, so you have the kernels on the ear.
And you have no ears here at all.
And there was no tassel. There's absolutely no ears on that stalk. You know, you look. Here's such a small ear, right here. You can peel that back. See, it has silk, and there's the cob. Now that
should be on a salad.
Yeah, there's nothing on it. I mean, that should be 4 times that size, and once in a while you see a little kernel that's pollinated. So that's going to abort. So you'll get nothing off of that. And of course, these have already aborted and haven't even shot an ear on any of that.
So, will the US drought lead to another global food crisis? And what does it tell us about the current structure of the world food system? To discuss this, we're joined by Francesco Femia, founding director of the Center for Climate and Security, by Charlotte Hebebrand, chief executive of the International Food and Agricultural Trade Policy Council, and from Berkeley, California, Eric Holt-Gimenez, executive director of Food First, an Institute for Food and Development Policy. Perhaps first of all, we'll take a slightly closer look at the extent of the drought and its effect on crops. 60% of the continental US is experiencing moderate to extreme drought conditions, including the nation's breadbasket. At least 87% of all US corn and soybean crops are growing in drought-stricken regions. In mid-July, the US Department of Agriculture revealed that nearly 40% of the country's corn crop was in poor to very poor condition. And the USDA predicted that corn yields would be down at least 12% in 2012. Since then, prices for both corn and soybeans have hit all-time records. Francesco Femia, then, all this has led many to believe that we'll see spikes in US supermarkets for dairy products, meat, poultry, and so forth. But how will this affect the rest of the world, do you think?
Well, I think it could have a direct effect on those nations that are importers of corn, first and foremost. Also, who depend on dairy and meat. I mean, corn is essentially used for animal feed as well, and so those price spikes will be significant. I think for parts of Central America, will be significant for countries like India, who are significant importers of corn. And so I think directly, this particular drought will have some impact on other nations outside the United States.
And what about the arguments we often hear, though, that whereas in 2008 the crisis was based on shortages of rice and wheat, whereas because this is based on corn and soybean, perhaps it's not going to be so serious for the rest of the world?
Well, I think it's difficult to tell how serious this will be, but I also think, the way we've been looking at this is in the context of a number of other extreme weather events that have occurred. Whether we're talking about last year's Texas drought, but also across globally, looking at a number of other droughts and extreme weather events that have occurred since 2010, which have impacted other crops such as wheat. So 2010, for example, we had a major drought in China, which led the Chinese government to purchase a lot of wheat, and that drove prices up. And we're seeing that happening in other places. We have soy prices being affected by what's happening in Argentina.
And that's interesting because another argument that those who want to downplay any idea of food crisis argue, Charlotte Hebebrand, is that because grain stocks are higher than 2008, then again we might not see such runs on the market and so forth. However, that's assuming that this grain is actually released on the market, I suppose. I mean, China surely has no incentive really necessarily to put that on the market.
Yeah, I mean, I would, first of all, maybe to your first question, say, obviously the U.S. consumer will be impacted by what is happening here. In the short run, however, you're not going to see a really drastic price increase in meat and dairy products, because in the short run, the livestock producers and the slaughterhouses actually want to get their product to the market because feed prices are going up. But certainly in the long run, you'll see increases. But yes, most corn and soy is used for feed. The other differentiation I would make between U.S. consumers and folks in poorer countries is the amount of their disposable income that's spent on food. In developed countries like the U.S., it's between 10 and 15%. In some poor countries, folks can spend up to 75% of their income on food. So obviously, a price increase there will be felt much more strongly than here in the U.S. The other thing about the U.S. diet is here folks eat a lot of processed food. So the actual component of the particular commodity, in this case corn or soy, is actually quite small.
Don't they stick corn syrup in everything, though? And of course,
yeah, exactly. But that's just a small component of the final product. So most of what you're actually paying for at the supermarket is the processing and packaging, et cetera. It's not the actual commodity itself. Poor people depend on commodities. So when prices of commodities go up, they really feel it.
Eric Holt-Gimenez, though, what we're being told, again by those who are suggesting this might not be catastrophic, is that those countries who do depend on imports are playing it cool. They have learnt from previous food crises. They don't want to drive up prices by suddenly panic buying. But how long can they wait? And surely when one decides to start buying, surely the price will go up and others will have to follow, and won't that have economic consequences?
Well, yes, but let me first point out that here in the United States, the richest country in the world and produce more than anybody else except possibly China. Also, we have 1 in 7 of our citizens are food insecure. And so, like other food importing countries, many of our food importing communities, underserved communities, are going to feel the effects of the price spikes, which are sure to come. And I think that the ripples will be felt, of course, around the world. And I think because of the fact that from 2008, 2011, and now here we are, 2012, nothing's been done to basically change the structure of the corporate food regime, our global food system. We can expect many of the same results, whatever the trigger happens to be, whether it's a spike in wheat or a spike in corn or a little too much speculation on the part of Goldman Sachs. Because we haven't made any changes to those structures, I think that we can expect the same types of disasters that we saw in the past, and I think we might have a few new surprises. For example, if the price of soy begins to squeeze China, who imports quite a bit of soy to feed pigs, because pork is such a big product in China, if that ends up pushing up food inflation and inflation in general in China, then I think we could see sort of the international financial repercussions that we saw just a couple of years ago with the financial crisis, which was set off, as we should all remember, first by a food price crisis.
Right, there's this amazing combination of events from financial crisis to climate change and so forth. Eric Holt-Gimenez, is this what has been called the globalization of hazard then? Is that the system that we're talking about now? I'm sorry, Francesco.
Yes, I think so. And there's a great thinker, Dr. Troy Sternberg, who talks about the globalization of hazards, and he talks about the China example. But I do think so. And I think what we need to look at, and this goes back to your recent point about how food secure the United States is, well, how secure is the United States going to be 20 years out, and how insecure are the most insecure places right now going to be 20 years out?
What specific occurrences could we see happening as a result of the current drought?
Of the current
drought? In the US, yeah.
Sure. Well, I think, the current drought, in terms of making us less secure, I think is unknown, actually, and I wouldn't hazard to answer that question. What I would say, though, is that what we're likely to see over the next 10, 15, 20 years, and in some cases in a shorter time period, is more extreme weather events of this kind. It's difficult for us to say, well, this particular drought was due to climate change, and many analysts actually see it as related to La Nina, the sister of El Nino.
It's certainly loading the die, as they say.
It's loading the die. It's a threat multiplier. It's a stress multiplier. We're going to be looking at more of these, and what we're going to be looking at is water that comes either more often or less often in certain places, or we're going to be looking at water that comes when we don't expect it, or doesn't come when we don't expect it. And so it's that intensification and also the variability that's going to cause some serious problems going forward.
And Charles Hebebrand, I suppose the point that Eric Holt-Gimenez...
If I might just add about the globalization of hazards. Because, yes, hazards are certainly being globalized, and we're having more and more extreme weather events. But hazards become disasters depending on the level of vulnerability of the societies which they hit. And of course, we're not all going to suffer equally from these hazards. So the 48 million people who are food insecure in the United States will suffer much more from this particular food price hazard, as will many of the food importing countries in the global south.
And I suppose that's the point.
And I should just say, this vulnerability has been constructed. It didn't come about accidentally. The global south back in the 70s used to export $1 billion worth of food every year. Now it imports $1 billion of food, dependent on this very vulnerable global food market, highly vulnerable to both environmental and economic shock.
Charlotte Hebebrand, that is the argument that this is the reckoning now. This is the culmination of decades of pushing what is basically a failed global food system, whether for those in the US due to neoliberal economic policies here, or the neoliberal principles having been exported around the world, in fact pushed on countries around the world. It wasn't working terribly well anyway, and there's no way it's going to work under these conditions now.
Yeah, let me express my views about globalization in the food system. But maybe before, I do want to acknowledge your very good point, Eric, about the poor in the U.S. In fact, the Farm Bill, which actually a large part of the Farm Bill that is pending passage, we hope it will be passed in the U.S., a large part of that actually pertains to food security programs in the U.S. Expenditures on food aid in the U.S. have gone up dramatically, as one would expect with poverty increasing.
It's all going to be passed for a while, isn't it?
That unfortunately is hung up in the Congress right now, so we do think that's important to pass. Now, on the globalization, let me offer you a little bit more of a different perspective on this. In my mind, globalization is basically means that the world is increasingly interdependent. I think that is happening not just in the food system, but in many, many sectors. I actually think that's a positive thing, because what a globalized food system allows is that we can source food from many different places. So, a country doesn't...
We can source it from many different places.
Well, the world can. If you're tapped into international markets, you have the ability to buy food.
If you don't have the money, then you really can't source
Eric, we'll come to you in a second.
No, certainly money matters, but I believe in comparative advantage. So a country produces what it's good at producing, exports that, and it buys the things that it's not so good at producing. So basically, I don't know if Eric is heading towards a system where countries are self-sufficient. Now, in my view, there are very few countries in the world that are blessed from a sort of climatic and even geographic perspective to be able to do that. Most countries in the world cannot feed themselves. And if they did try, I think it would come at a tremendous economic and actually also environmental cost. I don't think that's sustainable for most countries in the world. So I actually think an open, globalized trading system provides you with a lot of additional security rather than relying just on your internal market.
Eric Holt-Gimenez, would you agree then that this is sort of a benign market that just gives everyone what they need, basically?
Well, no, that's not the case at all, of course. And that's why many countries who can afford to do so avoid the global market entirely, which has brought about a huge land rush in Africa on the part of the Arab states, China, Korea, etc., because they know that they can't depend on the global market because it's so volatile. And the reason it's so volatile is because this dependency, or this interdependency, is in fact not an interdependency at all. It's a dependency on the monopolies. In other words, the monopolies have created dependency, and they control the global market. So ADM, Cargill, Bunge control the grain market. And you have tremendous, tremendous market power concentrated into just very few hands. And what we've seen over and over again is basically that they will hoard. They'll hold back grain. And they buy low, they sell high. So when grain prices go down, they win. When grain prices go up, they win. The big winners in every single crisis, food price crises that we've had, have been the monopolies who've seen windfall profits. Now, I don't think that's the type of dependency which is going to help the world. And I think that particularly poor people in poor countries who don't have enough money to buy food do not benefit from this type of dependency. So even though we may not be able to have complete self-sufficiency anywhere in the world, and we need some level of interdependence, we need a much better level of equity, transparency, and maybe we should start enforcing some of our antitrust laws if we're really serious about ending hunger.
Yes. Can I jump in on that point? Because I think there are shocks. A globalized world carries dangers. So there are shocks that can be transmitted through the trade system. For example, 2010, Russia had an incredible situation with fires and basically banned the export of wheat. Now, prices shot through the roof. Those kinds of price insulating measures have a huge impact on food prices at an international level and food security. Now, some folks say, you know, that's an example of how a globalized world is doing us damage. I would say that's an example of where we simply haven't gotten far enough in establishing trade rules to make sure that markets remain open in times of crisis.
But isn't the lesson of the last few decades that these trade negotiations are weighted in favor of those who perhaps need those, you know, need the level playing field? I mean, isn't that the one lesson? And meanwhile, Francesco.
Sorry, can I just make one more point on that? I think the point that Eric was making about developing countries, you know, some decades ago having more agricultural production is absolutely true. Now, why is it that that's declined? I think it's declined because there have been unfavorable agricultural policies in a lot of developed countries, including the US. So you've had a lot of subsidies that have basically had a trade distorting impact and have led to decreased investment in agricultural sectors in developing countries. Our vision, IPC's vision of an open trading system means one where there is no unfair subsidies like that. So,
right. So
basically,
I mean, that's just never going to happen, is it?
Well, unless we keep fighting for it. I mean, if we give up, then...
But Francesco, let's just talk about what is going on right now. I mean, let's remind ourselves of why many of these countries are food insecure, who once actually were net food exporters, if anything. I mean, they were basically told, you know, join the global market, don't grow your own food for your own markets, sell them to us, to Cargill, to everyone else, join the export market, and then buy back your food you need. I mean, that was basically what happened, wasn't it?
I think so. And what I would place myself in between these two wonderful individuals, and just say that, you know, if we assume that the global food market as it exists now will continue on for a certain amount of time, and that we won't reform our subsidies regimes in developed countries, you know, in the near future, then I think we need to be very conscious of some shocks coming out of climatic changes. And you mentioned the 2010 Russia example, and two different studies, one by Ramsdorff and Kumu and another by Otto and some of his colleagues, have actually linked that quite explicitly to climate change. And
but meanwhile, I mean, also, yeah. I mean, Eric alluded to this perhaps, right. The profit motive. I mean, should people be allowed to gamble on our food supply, particularly traders and Goldman Sachs and others there? I mean, isn't that rather reprehensible?
I think there are a number of arguments on this. You know, I generally stay out of those particular debates.
All right, well, we'll move on. Eric, the point that when we look at solutions, we're not necessarily looking at reforming then, you know, trading on hunger and looking at these monopolies and so forth. There's now, certainly in the US, it's becoming very normal for liberals to be saying, well, look, the thing to do now is a new green revolution for Africa, basically. And when we say green revolution, we don't mean environmentally friendly practices as we think of a green now, but we think of, you know, harking back to the 60s and 70s of intense chemical-based agriculture, which some say, decimated parts of Latin America and elsewhere. This is what Bill and Melinda Gates is doing with Monsanto and so forth. Is that the future then? The Financial Times said, people advocating that should get the Nobel Prize. But what do you make of that?
Well, first, the fact that the Consultative Group for International Agricultural Research dedicated something like a third of its budget for 25 years to the Green Revolution in Africa and failed miserably should tell us something. But look, the problem is that the Green Revolution ended up differentiating the peasantry. In other words, the richer peasants got richer and the poorer peasants went hungry. Most of the people who are going hungry in the world today, something like 70%, are peasants, and they're very poor. They produce about half of the world's food, nonetheless. But the point is that we have to have policies and technologies which help them have access to more land, more resources, and more security in terms of production and local markets, not global markets. Global markets destroy them, and the Green Revolution will destroy them as well. Where will they go? There's no big manufacturing sector to sop them up. There's no industrial revolution to all these people up. They've got to stay on the land. And the Green Revolution eventually pushes farmers off the land and concentrates it in very few hands. So no, I don't think the Green Revolution is the answer at all. I think even though it could produce plenty of food. Look, right now we produce enough food for everybody. 1.5 times enough food for everybody, according to the FAO. And still we have 1 billion people going hungry. The problem is poverty, not production per se. And people are going hungry even though they produce food. And the reason is because they don't have enough land, they don't have enough water, and they get clobbered in the markets. And they end up having to buy food back when they don't have any money. So those are the issues we really have to address.
Francesco, that has always been the question here. If we're making so much food, why can't we feed everyone? And of course the answer is poverty. With climate change, though, now in the mix, though, could that question be changing as the decades come to, well, maybe we aren't able to grow enough food for everyone because of severe weather events and drought and dust bowls and so forth. In that case, everything will change once again then.
Sure, I think that's certainly a possibility. And if we see significant shocks based on most climate projections, whether it's the IPCC or it's the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration looking out 10, 15, 20 years, we will see more of these types of events, and we'll see, and that will impact our ability to grow food. And whether or not you subscribe to Eric's vision or Charlotte's vision, I think we're going to have difficulty growing food both in the developed world and in the developing world, if projections play out as they have.
And Charlotte Hebebrand, though, your argument is, look, we'll keep on going to reduce subsidies, make this a level playing field, and we'll just continue with the system where, look, if one country's crop fails, we'll just buy it from somewhere else, and an equilibrium will be found.
Absolutely. Let me just also respond to something you said, because I think the Green Revolution, yes, did it have problems? Yes. Was it enormously successful? Yes. So I wouldn't want us to...
But in the long term, though, there are deserts in Mexico.
Well, we talk an awful lot about reaching the 9 billion mark by 2050. That's peanuts compared to the population growth that we've seen over the last few decades. So if you see what agricultural productivity has been able to do over the last few decades...
Rather overblown.
It's been phenomenal growth. Now, has it come at some environmental expense? Absolutely. So I would actually argue that the new green revolution for Africa needs to be double green.
But when the U.S. Department of Agriculture looks at...
It does need to increase agricultural productivity, but it needs to do so in an environmentally sustainable way.
So does that mean genetically modified crops, or does it mean natural and traditional methods of breeding?
I think it's probably a mixture. I think we need all hands on the deck. I do think that besides getting rid of subsidies, that's not my panacea for the food system. I do think we need to really look at innovation. Innovation is going to have a tremendous impact on food security. We do need, whether it's biotech or not, there are some crops that can be drought resistant, for example.
But those claims are found to be completely overblown by the U.S.
But we have to look at the types of innovation.
We need to speed up that research. We need to be sure that research then, once it's done, can also be accessible to the smallholder farmer, because it is a fair...
Chain them even further then into the system where they're basically chained to agribusiness for the rest of them.
Well, it depends on what you believe.
Right.
If you think that using agricultural inputs in a smart way increases your agricultural productivity, and then you have access to markets, you actually make more income, and that is a way out of what I agree with Eric. It's actually, a very difficult life for many of these smallholders. I don't think we should romanticize the way these
30 seconds, Eric. Could that work? Actually, 20 seconds.
No, the Green Revolution pushes poor farmers off the land and privileges the more privileged farmers. And that's historically been true, and it will happen again. I also believe in innovation. However, I think we need to choose our innovations very carefully and not choose the innovations which concentrate more and more power into the agribusinesses, which are basically destroying the planet.
Eric?
And so I think that we have tremendous advances in agroecology, much more democratic, much more dispersed, with much more promise in terms of climate-resistant
Holt-Gimenez, we're going to have to stop you there, Eric. Thank you very much. Charlotte Hebebrand, thank you very much.
You.
Francesco Femia, thank you very much. That's all from the Washington, D.C. team for now.